Number two, my favorite journalist, Bill Gertz, as you can read in your program, is indeed an internationally recognized national security journalist, currently National Security Columnist for the Washington Times, author of 8 books, including 4 national bestsellers. He's been with the Washington Times almost since its inception. His stories are the stories you want to read, and they are stories that you can fully rely upon, in my experience, unless Bill tells us otherwise. But I'd like to bring him up here to specifically address, as Bill put it, the Washington Times and the end of the Cold War.
Thank you. Okay. Great. Let's see here. Oh, can you hear me okay there? Okay. Yeah, I want to go through this a little bit. I was hoping that we would have some time for questions. On Tom's comment, remarks, I was thinking, boy, it would be great if we could get the liberal left in the United States to get rid of Hate America Month. But I'm gonna read from my notes here. And on April 10th, 1991, the official newspaper of the Soviet military, called Krasnaya Zvezda, or Red Star, published an article with the headline, "How many hats does Mr. Gertz have?" The author was Major General Gennady Kashuba, who's chief of the Soviet Defense Ministry press office, and the article accused me of, who was a national security writer at the Times, of spreading base misinformation, which is ironically a Soviet specialty at the time. The article took issue with 2 stories that I had written days earlier. One was on a secret visit to the recently dissolved East Germany by Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov in March of 1991, and it was part of Moscow's plan to get Erich Honecker, the Soviet puppet leader in East Germany, out of the country. The German government was ready to prosecute him for the deaths of some 200 East Germans who had been killed trying to flee to the Free West during the Cold War. But the second story that I had written was really the focus of Moscow's ire. It was a piece written about the extensive and well-funded Soviet disinformation operations run by the KGB. And basically their goal was to poison world opinion about the United States while seeking to build support for the Soviet Union. The campaigns by the KGB included the lie published in African newspapers that the AIDS virus was a CIA biological warfare weapon developed for the use against African Americans and Africans. Red Star asserted that in Britain there's a saying that someone caught lying must eat his hat. That's where the headline came from. Thus the article concluded that I would need to eat several hats and that they were a regular part of my diet. It also contained the subtle suggestion that I was dual-hatted in the sense that I was a journalist, but there was also the false allegation that I was somehow a running dog for the CIA, which would certainly surprise people at the CIA, since one of their spokesmen one time threatened to fire a cruise missile at my desk at the Washington Times after I had reported on the problems with the Chinese intelligence analysis at CIA. Anyway, this story was an amazing acknowledgement for me as a journeyman reporter at the time of the power of one reporter to impact this vast communist empire. I regarded it then, as I do now, as a badge of honor to be singled out. And the clipping of that story in Russian was presented to me by a guy named Herb Romerstein, who was a patriotic American official who was a communist turned anti-communist, and he headed a special group in the State Department that countered Soviet disinformation. And he was among the many hundreds of government officials who regarded the Washington Times as a strategically vital tool in winning the Cold War against Soviet communism. 8 months later, after I wrote those stories, the Soviet Union was dissolved and ended the expansionist communist empire, and it marked what many consider the end of the Cold War. In reality, the Cold War has not ended, and there are, in fact, in my latest book on China called Deceiving the Sky, I argue that we're now in the beginning of a new Cold War with China, with communist China. But in any case, the Washington Times was founded in 1982 by Reverend Sun Myung Moon amid concerns that the media landscape in Washington was dominated by the liberal establishment newspaper, the Washington Post. It had become known as Pravda on the Potomac after the famous Soviet Communist Party newspaper. Today, it's also become very liberal. They seem to have dropped a lot of their pretense of objectivity and fairness, and they've been now dubbed the Amazon Post after their owner, Jeff Bezos. The roots of the Washington Times can be traced to the Washington Star. In 1981, the Star folded. It was a venerated daily newspaper that had spanned centuries. It was back into the 1800s, and it was really the establishment newspaper. It was bought by Time magazine, but Time, as a news magazine, was ill-suited to running a daily newspaper, and eventually they folded it. Lacking both funding and experienced news personnel, Reverend Moon launched the Washington Times largely on faith and the firm belief that, and concern that the Washington leaders would not be educated about the growing danger posed by Soviet communism. Over the ensuing years, he invested tens of billions of dollars in the Washington Times, and he explained to aides that the newspaper was a mission more than a business, and that he had been inspired by God to make the important commitment to the newspaper. And that commitment has continued under his wife, Hak Jahan Moon. For decades during the Cold War, there was a fundamental problem dealing with Soviet communism. The political divide split the country between anti-communist conservatives who viewed the Soviet Union as a strategic threat to be defeated, and liberal left anti-communists, or those who opposed anti-communists. And the political divide meant that the early Cold War foreign policy approach of containment, essentially leaving the Soviets alone while seeking to prevent its spread, could not be altered or modified. Reverend Moon's motivation for the Times was not simply to use the newspaper to educate leaders and seek the defeat of communism. It was part of a larger effort that he believed would bring about world unity and ultimately the creation of a God-centered world. The DNA of the Washington Times was the need for this conservative alternative to the Post. And he recognized that news media are essential, not just for news, but for the educational role of helping leaders and populations understand the true nature and danger of communism, this atheistic, anti-human ideology that denies God and seeks to use government controls to alter human nature. The ideology, as Tom mentioned, is outlined in detail in the Black Book of Communism. A decision was made early on in the foundation of the paper, led by a close associate of Reverend Moon's named Dr. Bohe Pak, that the paper would remain a secular newspaper, and it would be independent of the unification movement. And the newspaper's initial leadership was largely drawn from old Washington Star people, including Smith Hempstone and Woody West, along with many former Star reporters. The newspaper's power and influence greatly expanded in the mid-'80s after Arno de Boer Crowe, a Newsweek correspondent, took the helm and became executive editor. He was assisted by Wes Pruden and Woody West, and especially at the commentary section by Pulitzer Prize-winning editor Mary Lou Forbes. Those are really the founders of the paper and really got it going. She directed the commentary section. De Boer Crowe was really key to putting the newspaper on the map, and he was very aggressive. He had a Murphy bed in his office that he slept in, and he was constantly, his office was on the second floor of the mezzanine of the paper. And he would get story ideas and write them on yellow note cards about this size. And he'd come outside and he'd scream to reporters, "Gertz, over here." And he would throw these over. We used to call them Yellow Rain from Arno de Boer Crowe. He was an ardent anti-communist, patriotic conservative, and he passed in 2015. But he was really instrumental in getting his contacts within the Reagan administration at the time to really utilize the Washington Times. The Washington Times really, in much the same way that Fox News and talk radio is, we were really the beginning point for having the alternative view of the outside of the liberal table. And people really, really loved us for that. They really understood that this was urgently needed. Reagan, as a former actor and GE spokesman, understood better than any modern politician the power of ideas and the use of media to convey them. Reagan quickly revolutionized the establishment foreign policy toward communism and the Soviet Union by clearly identifying Moscow as the enemy to be defeated. More importantly, he set in motion covert and overt policies that quickened its demise and resulted in the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89, fall of the Soviet Union in '91. Reagan would say in '92 in a video message, "You, my friends at the Washington Times, have told the truth. It wasn't always the popular thing to do, but you were a loud and powerful voice. Like me, you arrived in Washington at the beginning of the most momentous decade of the century. Together, we rolled up our sleeves and went to work. And oh yes, we won the Cold War." Reagan demanded that aides would deliver the Washington Times to him, along with the Post and the New York Times, wherever he was in the world. And I learned this from one of his Secret Service agents. Let me wrap up here. Reverend Moon said of the paper in 2002, he said, this new era of media, with the massive distribution of news and information, requires leadership and clear guidance for the betterment of individuals based on values and on the knowledge of God and the spirit world. The Washington Times and our family of media have been providing this direction for the past 2 decades and will continue to do so into our 3rd decade. My hope is that each one of you as well will embody the qualities of defending freedom, promoting family values, and strengthening your faith in God so that you may become leaders of the world. So our strategy at the time and to some extent today is that we can't compete directly with a lot of the major publications because we simply don't have the resources to send people and to far off places. But we focused on unique areas, and we always tried to make sure that we kept our news straight. Even though we were regarded as a conservative newspaper, we voiced our conservative views in the commentary section. In our news section, we kept things very straight. And that's why I think that I won't go through the list of stories, but we covered some of the most important stories at the time, and they included the debate over arms control and the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which led to the establishment of missile defenses, which revolutionized the entire concept of strategic defense against nuclear weapons. We went after foreign intelligence. We even helped the Contras in South America in something that was very controversial. When Congress cut off funding for the Contra rebels, the Washington Times started a private fund through a private outfit that would try to help keep the Contras from for battling against the Sandinista communists in Nicaragua. Let me end up with a quote from Margaret Thatcher, what she had to say, the late former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. She said, "In difficult times, even more than in easy ones, the voice of conservative news must make itself heard in the media. It isn't always easy, but this we can be sure. While the Washington Times is alive and well, the conservative news will never be drowned out. And they are heard and they will prevail." That is the ideas. Thank you very much.